Shooting in log has become a big deal in filmmaking, and more cameras are providing this feature, even reaching down into affordable consumer-level cameras. But log by itself creates ugly, flat, washed-out looking footage, so inevitably this has led to a lot of confusion. So is log worth it? And why does it look so bad? And how can you make it work for you? If you've been around filmmaking for any length of time, you may have come across images which look flat, grey and washed out, or in simple terms, crap. You may have got a cinematic camera and be shooting a log because people have told you that it's the best, but it doesn't look very great when you see the finished result. Or you may be a producer on a project, for example, and be looking at the footage on the monitor and be worried that it's going to look dreadful in the final edit. The camera department might reassure you that it's just log and it's going to be okay, but that's cold comfort if you can't actually see that something useful is being recorded. So what's going on? Why do the camera people insist on shooting log? Or if you're a camera person, should you be shooting a log? And how do you make it look good? In this video, I'm going to try to clear all this up. So let's go. When you record something digitally, which is pretty much anything these days, the information has to be converted to numbers because that's all a computer can deal with. The colours in an image are represented by storing the amount of red, green and blue as numbers. Actually, there are many different ways to represent colour, but this will do for now. And in fact, I'm going to simplify by just focusing on brightness, which is what matters here. The actual numbers are in a limited range based on the precision of the camera. If your camera has 8-bit recording, the numbers go from 0 to 255. 256 different values for each colour component, because that's a round number in binary. With 10-bit recording, you would have 1024 different values, with 12-bit 4096, and so on. Each added bit doubles the number of values you have available. So the remaining question is how exactly to convert colours to these numbers. It might seem simple, with 10-bit colour going from 0 to 1023, black would be 0, full white would be 1023, and halfway in between would be 512. But in practice it's not so simple. Different sensors have different sensitivities, and they're not likely to be linear, and neither are our eyes. So exactly how this conversion gets done in practice can vary between different devices. It's not likely to be drastic, but it does mean that the colour reproduction between devices can be a bit off. To solve this, the broadcast industry came up with a standard called ITUR Recommendation BT709, or commonly just Rec 709. This standard specifies exactly how colours are translated to numbers. So if your camera shoots Rec 709 and your monitor displays Rec 709, you should be set. Okay, it's not that simple because monitors generally have their own colour controls, but the principle is there. So what's the problem? Well, Rec 709 is perfectly fine for representing an image, but it's not ideal for capturing an image that you might want to manipulate later. Basically, it doesn't have very much dynamic range. A value of 0 might represent a basic black and 1023 a basic white, but there might be super white details like clouds in the sky brighter than that basic white. The problem is they would all be encoded as 1023 as well, because there's no larger number available. If you subsequently darken the image in post, that big ugly slab of white in the sky will become a big ugly slab of grey. This is where log encoding comes in. With log, we use a wider dynamic range, meaning that the colour values in the middle of the range get squished together to make room for more colour values. So now a basic black might be 200 and a basic white might be 800. So there are more numbers available to encode those super whites and super blacks. The important thing to note here is that this is a trade-off. Yes, you get more dynamic range, but at the cost of colour resolution. You now only have 600 values to encode all the colour levels from basic black to basic white, instead of over 1000. To sweeten the deal, log encoding schemes use a non-linear encoding, specifically logarithmic encoding, to concentrate the value squishing in the parts of the brightness spectrum where it's least visible, leaving the maximum colour resolution for the parts we can see most easily. In other words, it uses the available range of numbers more efficiently to allow a wider range of colour values without losing much, if any, visible image quality. So log is a trade-off, but it's a smart trade-off, which is why it's so popular. However, the value squishing can still be a problem if you don't have enough colour values to begin with. So on an 8-bit camera, log might do more harm than good. With 10 bits and above, you have 4 times as many values to play with, so log should be fine. An important thing to understand is that log isn't a different file format. Its numbers are just stored in a file in exactly the same way as Rec. 709. It's the way that colours are turned into those numbers which is different, and you can't see that in the file. So if you send your video to a monitor or just load it into an editor, the target will assume that it's Rec. 709. If it's actually log, then your video will look flat and desaturated, which is why we get the problem we saw at the beginning. If your video is log, you have to tell your hardware or software, or it's going to look like crap. This isn't always true. Sometimes you load your video into an editor and it knows the correct colour space. This is because your camera can save the colour space as metadata in the video file, and your editor can read that metadata so that it knows how to interpret the colour values. However, this doesn't work for all file formats, and it generally doesn't work for a video stream that you're sending to a monitor, so it's kind of hit or miss. So okay, log is a good idea, and a lot of film people use it. So why is there still all this confusion? Why doesn't a monitor just have a switch on the side that goes from Rec. 709 to log? Well, the reason is because log isn't actually a standard. Rec. 709 is a standard. There's literally a document that specifies exactly how to convert colours to numbers. But with log, there is no such standard. The reason for that is that log is a trade-off, and there is no one right trade-off. You could create a log curve that assigns more colour values to the shadows or to the highlights, or one that creates more dynamic range at the cost of colour resolution, or vice versa. In other words, there are infinitely many ways to do log, and over the years camera manufacturers have tinkered with this to try to get the best results for their camera. Also, over time, sensors have improved, and if a sensor with more dynamic range needs a log curve that can render that dynamic range. So log isn't a standard, it's a concept, and each camera maker does it differently. In fact, it's worse than that, as over the years each camera maker has typically done it in multiple different ways. Canon has Canon Log 2, Canon Log 3, Sony has S-Log, S-Log 2 and S-Log 3, Arri has Log C3 and Log C4, and so on. Each of these converts colours to numbers slightly differently. So you can only work with log footage if you know which specific log profile it was shot in, and that includes for monitoring as well as for editing. So to work with log footage, you need to know the exact log profile it was shot with. In other words, the exact formula that the camera used to convert colour values into numbers, so that you can reverse that formula. You could just guess at it, of course. In the edit, you could take your log footage, boost the saturation, add an S-curve to increase contrast, and it would probably look pretty good. In fact, this would be perfectly valid. After all, the point of colour grading is not to make an exact reproduction of what was in front of the camera, but to make something that looks good. If you tweak the sliders by hand and end up with something that looks nice, that's fine. There are problems with this approach though. It's a lot of work and it's hard to get consistent results. If you have 100 clips and you tweak them all by hand, it's going to be a ton of work and it's going to be hard to get a consistent look. It would be better to have an automated way to reverse the camera's log profile exactly, so that you then have a consistent base on which to start colour grading for real. And this is where a LUT comes in handy. So let me quickly explain what a LUT is. LUT stands for lookup table, and that's basically what it is. For each pixel in your image, the colour of that pixel is looked up in a table, and the table says what colour to replace it with. It's interpolated, so the table doesn't actually contain every possible colour. So a LUT can describe how to replace colours with different colours in any way at all. Essentially, it's a colour correction preset, but in a form that's really simple, so it's separate from any specific colour grading software. And that's why it's a widespread industry standard. LUTs can be used for any kind of colour grading at all, like adding or removing saturation, or adding a teal and orange look, or whatever. And for converting from one colour space to another, such as from some log profile to Rec. 709. So the camera manufacturers generally publish a set of LUTs, which will convert their camera's log footage to Rec. 709. And with those LUTs you can get the definitive colour correction for your footage. This doesn't replace the colour grading process, but it means that you have a consistent base to start that process from. LUTs are such a simple standard that many filmmaking monitors support LUTs. So if you have such a monitor, you can install your camera's LUT on it, typically by copying it over on a memory card, and then the monitor can decode your camera's log output and display it correctly. Again, this isn't showing you what the output of your colour grade will look like, but it at least shows you that you have some decent footage going into that grade. Some cameras have this functionality built in. For example, Canon calls it View Assist, Sony have Gamma Display Assist, and so on. This is very useful as you can see the decoded footage on the camera's own monitor, and you can even preview the footage on monitors that don't have LUT support, like a plain old TV set. But the camera still records log so that you have all the flexibility for grading in post. So if you shoot log, get a hold of your camera's LUTs. There will usually be a set of these to choose from. You might see 1D LUTs, which are basically obsolete, so get the 3D ones, which come in .cube files. You might also see these in different resolutions. Usually you want more resolution, so get the 65 grid LUTs if you can, although some older monitors might only support 33 grid LUTs. And beyond that, just get the LUT for the colour space conversion you need, like from your camera's log curve to Rec. 709. Having shot your footage in log, you will want to colour grade it. It might seem obvious to just load your footage into your editor, apply the appropriate LUT, and then colour grade from there, but don't do that. If you think about it, converting your footage to Rec. 709 as soon as you load it into your editor is no different than having your camera do the conversion. In fact, you may as well just set the camera to shoot Rec. 709 in the first place. In other words, converting your footage as soon as you load it in throws away the whole benefit of log. You want to do your grade, or at least any significant adjustments, while the footage is in the log domain. In other words, while it has that extra dynamic range. Remember that you might not be able to see the extra detail in the highlights, but it's there. As soon as you convert it to Rec. 709, it's gone. Here I have an example clip that was shot in log, and the highlights are pretty blown out as we look at it on the monitor. Now I can apply a LUT to convert this to Rec. 709, and then in a new node, apply an exposure correction to bring the levels down. Don't worry if you don't know about nodes, these are just processing steps. In any case, as you see, the result is pretty awful. The solid white snow is now solid grey. But if I swap over these two steps so that the exposure correction happens before the LUT, look at the difference. We now have real texture in the snow. So make sure to do your colour grade, or at least any major adjustments, while the footage is in the log domain. Your editing software may be able to help you with this. For example, Blackmagic's DaVinci Resolve has a feature called Colour Managed Mode, where you tell it what colour space your clips were shot in, and it takes care of everything else for you. You edit and grade your clips in a wide dynamic range colour space, and then it converts to Rec. 709 when you export. This makes life really simple. However you do your grade, one thing you will need to know is the exact colour space your footage was shot in other words, the exact log profile that was used. So if you're shooting something for someone else to edit, it's vital that you create a shooting report that specifies that. Taking phone pictures of your camera's settings can be a good way to do this. There's no question that log is more work and complicates your workflow. In fact, the golden rule is if you don't know what log is for, then you don't need it. Turn it off and make your life easier. But if you're colour grading your footage and you want to get the best out of it, then log can certainly help. The workflow encompasses your camera settings and your post workflow, but also things like how you monitor while you're shooting. So it's not trivial, but once you've got your workflow set up, it needn't be terribly hard. Log gives you access to more gradability, letting you produce a better image from your source material, as long as you grade in log to take advantage of the extra dynamic range it provides. It's not magical, and you still need to pay attention to your exposure while shooting, but it can help a lot. Anyway, that's a quick introduction to the basic concepts of log. I hope this has been helpful, and thanks for watching.